Just so very excited to have you here. And as Liz said, such a nice subject to be able to talk about because we actually have some solutions and ways to work with something that is more tangible than perhaps the events of the world going on right now. So grateful for that. For those of you who have not been here before, just so you know, Wednesday Wellness at Westside is a ministry of Westside Presbyterian Church, and it's intended to help all of those who are on a journey for wellness. We're a collaborative learning community, and we seek to integrate the entire body, so body, mind, spirit, and will. Tonight, our subject is eco-anxiety, and it's a phenomenon that is just beginning to be recognized and named as more and more people become directly impacted by climate change. And Blair Nelsen is here to help explain what this is, heart-centered strategies for coping with it, and how to avoid burnout. Blair is the executive director of Waterspirit, which is a nonprofit center for spiritual ecology based in Rumson, New Jersey. Through Waterspirit, she co-facilitates a 10-step eco-anxiety support group that will be described a little bit, I believe, in your talk this evening, right, Blair? And a little bit of background on Blair. She received her BA in Environmental Studies from Brown University, and she has a master's in religion from Yale Divinity School. I think there's so much more as I read up on you, Blair, and had such wonderful people that I just adore. Recommend you to come tonight and speak for us. So with all of that, I say welcome, and the time is yours. So thank you for being here and helping all of us with this.
Thank you so much, Pat and Liz, for the invitation. Thank you for that lovely introduction. While I kick things off tonight, I'm going to take a couple of seconds to share my screen. And then we'll get into it. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? I could use an audio confirmation.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay, so as Pat mentioned, I just want to reiterate one more time that my training is in environmental studies and in religious studies. The work I do is eco-spiritual. I'm not a mental health professional, so you're going to be hearing the perspective of somebody who thinks about these things quite a lot, and the linkages between caring for one's mental health as we face this climate crisis and spiritual care as we face it as well. Before I really get into the topic of understanding eco-anxiety, I would like to take a moment to read a land acknowledgement. Waterspirit is headquartered in Rumson, New Jersey. That is the homeland of the Navissing Glennie Lenape on the peninsula named Narromsunk. We respectfully acknowledge the Lenape peoples past, present, and future here in Lenapehoking and throughout the diaspora. We offer our care and gratitude for Lenapehoking, as well as our commitment to establish right relations with these lands and waters. And I've dropped a link for one organization, the Lenape Center, that benefits these original peoples directly. Now, my assumption is that with this group, I don't need to belabor the point too much when it comes to the impacts of climate change. They've been pretty visible and immediate and dramatic, including in this country, in particular after last summer's fire season on the West Coast and hurricane season throughout the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic. But just to bring these points up to the forefront of our minds, climate change impacts many different areas of our lives. In addition to increasing the incidence of natural disasters, it also increases the rate of forced migration. It impacts food security. It impacts the severity and duration and frequency of pandemics, such as the one we're living through right now, et cetera. And it also has significant human health impacts. So all these different, the cluster of physical impacts that are involved in climate change, including, as we see in this graphic, severe weather, air pollution, changes in vector ecology, increasing allergens, water quality impacts, water and food supply impacts, and environmental degradation and extreme heat. In addition to all of those, we also see related impacts upon human health that range from increased incidence of asthma and cardiovascular disease, heat-related illnesses and death, as we mentioned before, forced migration, civil conflict, malnutrition, problems with water quality as well, and harmful algal blooms. We see that here in New Jersey also. And in addition to all these physical impacts, we also see a number of mental health impacts. But sometimes the climate crisis is framed as something that is distant or happening somewhere else, either happening somewhere else physically or distant in time, something that will happen, or something that is currently impacting somebody who is not me. But I argue that we are all experiencing the impacts of climate change at this exact moment of time. We do not all experience them in the same way. We must remember always that there are disproportionate impacts, particularly on already overburdened communities, including here in New Jersey. And to be extremely relevant to the times that we're living through, at the beginning of lockdown last year, I heard a lot of talk about how people aren't commuting to work or flying around the world, and isn't that going to have a great impact on emissions worldwide? That's surely going to be good for the climate. But what the International Energy Agency actually found, there was approximately a mere 8% reduction in global emissions by the end of 2020. So, and what does that mean? That means that while individual actions have an impact, it's not nearly as big as the impact that we still need to have that comes from the systems that perpetuate climate change, exacerbated by things such as fossil fuel company bailouts in the middle of the pandemic and so forth. To continue bringing this home to New Jersey, I just want to bring up these two images very quickly. New Jersey is warming at a faster rate than the rest of the country. I believe it's on average a 2-degree warming, higher than the rest of the country. Sea level rise is going to impact this state pretty dramatically. I've included on the left a map that shows how much of Newark is going to be flooded in the future due to sea level rise. I could have shown you some pretty dramatic projections from down the shore where I am. And in addition to sea level rise, climate change will also worsen the impact in overburdened communities, and especially ones that are already very highly polluted. On the right, we see yellow dots representing all the different Superfund sites throughout New Jersey. Superfund sites are among the most polluted in this country. That's a designation by the EPA. And you can see that there's Superfund sites throughout the state. So this is something widespread happening everywhere. In addition to these physical impacts, let's zoom in now on the not always addressed mental health impacts of climate change. A document that I'll be referencing a lot throughout this presentation is a report that was put out in 2017 by the American Psychological Association and Eco-America and a few other authors. It's called Mental Health in Our Changing Climate. That's where this graphic comes from. So they list some of the mental health impacts as being depression, stress and anxiety, strains on social relationships, complicated grief, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, loss of personal identity, particularly when that identity is linked to place, and an increased sense of helplessness and fatalism. And once again, I would like to highlight that the mental health impacts are also disproportionately borne by different communities. To read out a statistic here, following Hurricane Sandy, lower income residents in impacted areas that had weak or absent social support networks had the greatest percentages of severe mental distress and diagnosis of depression or anxiety after the superstorm. Furthermore, 35% of children living in a household that earned less than $20,000 a year annually experienced increased feelings of sadness, depression, fear, or nervousness following the hurricane, as compared to households with a higher income. Now let's zone in on some of the terms that get more granular. Eco-anxiety is a pretty specific term that describes a particular state of being related to the climate crisis that we're currently in. It's a fairly new term. It hasn't been around for that long. As I mentioned, it particularly gained traction after this 2017 report in which the American Psychological Association defined eco-anxiety as chronic fear of environmental doom. Glenn Albrecht is a scholar who studies this phenomenon extensively and related phenomenon. He characterizes it as the generalized sense that the ecological foundations of existence are in the process of collapse. And sometimes when we talk about the mental health impacts of climate change, you might not hear the term eco-anxiety being used. You might hear one of a number of related terms, such as climate anxiety, eco-grief, eco-depression, eco-trauma, solastalgia, which is the loss of a sense of place as well, and pre-traumatic stress disorder. This term is particularly used by Dr. Lisa Van Susteren, who studies this extensively. She talks about pre-traumatic stress disorder, particularly impacting Gen Z and millennials as they begin to imagine what kind of world they would be bringing children into, for example, for those that are considering raising children. A number of reports have come out that younger generations are even putting off having children because of their worries about the ecological condition of our planet. So that loss of an imagined future, we can call it pre-traumatic stress disorder. And a scholar named Britt Ray, who runs a very good blog on this topic. The blog is called Gen Dread. She characterizes eco-anxiety as a moral emotion. Now, why is that important? When we talk about mental health, oftentimes we're looking at the individual level, but eco-anxiety or any one of its related states of being is not necessarily an individual disorder or an individual pathology, and from my point of view, and this is what Britt Ray argues as well. Rather, it is often a reaction to grappling with existential crisis and living within a sick society that perpetuates the condition that worsened this crisis. So eco-anxiety might be considered a moral reaction or a moral emotion to what is going on around us. I'd like to guide us through an exercise right now, if I may. Perhaps after I introduce this term eco-anxiety and some of the related terms, you might be left wondering, well, or reflecting upon what you yourself are feeling. So I'm going to guide us through. I'm going to encourage us to do this right now. We're going to take a minute and get really granular with what we're feeling. What do we feel when we hear the phrase climate change? Now you're going to do this with your mics off at your house. If you have pen and paper handy, fantastic. You might want to write it down. If not, you can just do this exercise mentally. But after I'm done explaining it, let's just go through all of the emotions that pop up when you hear the phrase climate change. Here's an example that comes out of the book Emotional Inflammation by Van Susteren and Colino, which was published last year. You can see that some of the words that popped up in this climate change word cloud example aren't necessarily even consistent or following any kind of logical order. It goes from optimistic to fearful to despondent to regretful, panicky, shame, disgust, confusion, positive. It goes all over the place. So without judgment, take about 1 minute right now to either write down or mentally feel all the different things that you feel when you hear the phrase climate change. And I'll time this. Go ahead. Take 5 more seconds to write down the last word, or to think the last word. And I'll take about 30 seconds to look over your list. See if there are any patterns. See if anything surprises you. Okay. This is the kind of internal reflection or exercise that you can return to whenever you need to do this kind of check-in with yourself. And how you're really doing. How are you, instead of reacting unconsciously to an existential crisis, to the climate crisis. This kind of exercise can help us ground in our own bodies, in our own states. We're really able to cultivate emotional intelligence and observe where we are. I'm going to share a little bit more about my story now, how I got involved in this work. So as Pat mentioned in the introduction, I was getting my master's degree at Yale Divinity School from 2017 to 2019. And I was doing a lot of studying about religion and ecology. And I started coming across articles about eco-anxiety. I started imagining to myself what a kind of climate pastoral care might look like, or within or not within a particular denomination or spiritual tradition. And then I got hired by Waterspirit. And as I was searching around for what kind of activities we might do, because I thought this married up very squarely with our eco-spiritual mission, I started hearing the story of Waterspirit told with the baggage of eco-grief. Waterspirit was founded by a sister of St. Joseph of Peace, Suzanne Golis, back in 1998. And Waterspirit was first located in a seaside beachfront retreat center named Stella Maris. I've never got to go there myself, but I've seen the pictures, and everybody who got the chance to go tells me how beautiful it was. I can really feel it through the stories that I'm told. And after Hurricane Sandy, the property sustained some damage, and that led to an environmental impact report. And there was a whole story where eventually the sisters decided to let go of the property. Waterspirit found the new home in the First Presbyterian Church of Rumson, right along a river as well. So we still got to stay connected to the water. But that grief from that followed in the wake of a natural disaster was still palpable in the way Waterspirit's story was being told to me. And some of my staff were still paying back loans from rebuilding their houses, and we're still experiencing the impacts of Hurricane Sandy even in 2019. So I thought to myself, maybe now's the time to try something, to try addressing this eco-grief and eco-anxiety about what's to come within my own organization, and offering that to the public. And so, Googling around, I found a methodology that involves 10 steps of meeting together, which I'll go through step by step explaining. But as that first 10-step eco-anxiety peer-to-peer support group was meeting, this was right after the climate march in New York in September 2019. And a group of reporters from Reuters came down to interview us about this eco-anxiety support group. So I'm going to share that video with us now, so you can get a little sense for what it felt like during that first group. Okay, let's see if I can share this big.
Sad, and frustrated. And it takes a lot to get me this sad.
Judy Kramer is a member of a support group for a rising mental health issue in the United States known as eco-anxiety. That's anxiety caused by climate change.
I'm willing to work hard, and I have been. And there are people all around who are inspiring, like Greta Thunberg. But I don't feel hopeful. So I came to this group because I have climate anxiety and climate grief.
Climate change, including more severe weather events, warmer temperatures and rising sea levels, according to the American Psychiatric Association, is having harmful effects on mental health, though the APA does not classify climate anxiety as a disorder. Still, some psychologists say there's a growing need for mental health care specific to climate change. Elizabeth Allred is a psychologist and psychoanalyst.
It's a huge problem. It's not like having a fear of going over bridges where you can just avoid going over the bridges. It can turn into some kind of anger and frustration that we don't recognize where it's coming from. But it's actually coming from this issue that's not being addressed adequately.
David Frett, a father of two, says he suffers from eco-anxiety. He participates in the same support group as Judy and describes the challenges he faces daily.
So few people even recognize the problem. It's one thing to not understand what the future may yield with having solutions, but to not even acknowledge that there's a similar problem that you understand just puts you in this lonely spot of trying to deal with it, and that's where the anxiety comes from.
Experts say activism may be one way to deal with anxiety. A great example, Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, who says she fell into despair at age 11 when she realized the gravity of climate change. Since then, she launched a global movement. One psychiatrist told Reuters, empowering action is the antidote to those horrific, overwhelming emotions.
Extended Stay America exists.
One moment. I'd actually like to complicate that assertion a little bit. I'm actually realizing that I'm running pretty long, but I will say that going through these steps of emotional analysis and processing in group is actually, to me, a necessary component of action. I think the video skips a little too quickly straight ahead to action. Action without this kind of inner renewal doesn't necessarily last. It can very easily lead to burnout. So we began offering this peer-to-peer eco-anxiety support group in order to cultivate personal resilience. This method is available on the Good Grief Network's website. Anybody can start up a peer-to-peer group anywhere. They offer great facilitation training. I'll walk us through those 10 steps, which are loosely based upon the Alcoholics Anonymous model. The first step is to accept the severity of the predicament. 2 is to practice being with uncertainty. 3 is to honor my mortality and the mortality of all. 4 is to do inner work. 5 is to develop awareness of biases and perception. 6 is to practice gratitude, witness beauty, and create connections. 7 is to take breaks and rest. 8 is to grieve the harm I have caused. 9 is to show up. And 10 is to reinvest into meaningful efforts. Now, this group is highly resourced. So each one of these steps, there are accompanying readings, and we have excellent conversations and check-ins with each other. And what we see, and I won't go through the quotes tonight, but what we see is that people from all different walks of life have benefited from this kind of peer-to-peer processing. So, when I first brought forward this program, I thought it would attract the Gen Z and millennials that I was reading about in these articles, and maybe people who weren't already very engaged with environmental actions. But what we found is that we had people who were just beginning to be involved in actions, people who had been long-term environmental advocates. We had grandparents and young people. We had people who were practicing. We had multiple mental health professionals who came because they still needed a place to process their own eco-anxiety in group. So the process has been fantastic, and that's why I'm so excited to share this kind of work with everyone. But to give you a very resumed or summarized version, some of the major coping strategies that help us address eco-anxiety and related states. 1, it's critical to strengthen communities. Find your people, because that is the thing that most helps us cultivate resilience. Particularly faith communities and spiritual practices are crucial in this work. To read out a quote that I've got in front of me, involvement in a faith community has been cited as a protective factor for mental health in several interview studies with people experiencing trauma. They can help us find meaning during significant adversity. They can help us cultivate this awareness of our interior states through mindfulness practices, etc. And that's why an eco-spiritual nonprofit is engaging in this peer support, because this is spiritual work as well. It is also important for us to practice critical hope. By critical hope, I mean neither a hope that is saccharine or empty or spiritual bypassing that shoots straight ahead to you have to be positive all the time. Neither is it giving in completely to desperation, to saying there's nothing left that we can do, to giving up. You know, a critical hope is a hope that allows space for grief, that allows space for recognition of trauma. You know, it's might be counter to the everything is getting worse narrative, to sum up Rebecca Solnit, but it's not a sunny everything is getting better. Absolutely. It's important to have those, to cultivate a hope that is nuanced. It's critical to regulate your exposure to known triggers. As Dr. Elise Van Susteren says, the ability to control one's immediate impulses in favor of a more considered long-term strategy is what it means to regulate that your emotions and engage in that self-regulation. So for example, if I know that doom scrolling on Twitter for 3 hours is going to set me off, maybe I set limits where I can do that for half an hour every day, and that will reduce one of my triggers. Setting those kinds of limits is critical. And the simple yet extremely effective practices of practicing gratitude, paying attention to the things that you want to cultivate, the good things, and savoring, really savoring moments, the good things, being present and aware. They're so simple, but psychological research tells us time and again that gratitude, attention, and savoring are 3 very, very powerful tools. And while we're practicing these coping strategies, we can also move into, of course, taking action. Remember that action takes multiple forms. It is not necessarily only, you know, big, loud shouting in a bullhorn, holding up a sign in the right place in front of the right important building that counts as taking action. I like to think of action in terms of this mushroom diagram that I've got on the slide right here. You know, underneath the ground are all of these hidden networks, hidden actions as communities are built and ties are built and people help each other. And people together are increasing their efficacy because they're believing in their efficacy. And then at the right moment when conditions are right, whoop, the very, very visible action, the mushroom pops up. But don't forget that invisible action. We in this room are connected to a sometimes invisible but vast network of people. So that's one of the things that sustains my own hope. There's so many people out there doing the good work, and I'm connected to them even if I don't always know it. It's critical for us to create our new stories, to create and tell our stories of where we want to go. That helps us get there. And ultimately, it's important to detach from the outcomes. You know, whether or not we see the results of our actions, we have to do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. For mental health professionals, it's critical to become eco-literate. For those who are policymakers or those who have access to policymakers, which is all of us, we should encourage them to implement climate change solutions. That same Eco America report gets into some of the mental health benefits of implementing climate change solutions, such as increasing public transportation and increasing green spaces and access to green spaces and investing in clean energy. They all have positive mental health impacts. Some additional resources, which I can send around this PowerPoint, make it available to folks. But in addition to the Good Grief Network's 10 Steps, an excellent book came out last year called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. I mentioned before Britt Ray's blog, Gen Dread, which is a great resource. There's also the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliance, which are great places for mental health practitioners to connect with like-minded folks and for those seeking services to find a professional in their area. And of course, Waterspirit offers periodically these 10-step eco-anxiety groups. You can join our next one starting March 2nd. You can reach out to me if you'd like to know more. We also offer seasonal rituals for connection and community on the equinoxes and solstices. We offer weekly meditation for Earth on our YouTube channel. And for those who are ready to take action, we have a rapid response team, which all of this is happening over Zoom right now. So you can join us from anywhere and get involved in your communities. Now I'm going to skip the visualization because we're running because I have talked quite a bit like I tend to do when I get started on this topic. But here are my contact points that I'll leave up for just another second before we get into Q&A. So you can have a chance to write them down really quick, but I'm sure that if you reach out to the organizers, they can also share those points afterwards if you don't have time to write it down right now. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open the floor. Thank you, everyone. Okay, let's see. Liz or Pat, how should we run the Q&A portion?
Okay, so generally we try to just kind of let you be polite and, unmute yourself and speak up. And usually it works out pretty well. I can't see everybody because there's several screens and many of you don't have your videos on, which is fine. So we can just maybe work it that way. Whoever feels that they have a question.
Hi, I have a question.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Allegra. I'm a recently graduated student. And first of all, thank you so much for the talk that you just gave. It was wonderful. I just have a question about the general trend in which you've observed climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. For me, it definitely happened when I started reading more about climate change. And I feel like it's the kind of thing where once you dip your toe in or your finger in and you realize how bad it is, then you quickly sort of fall into the depths of it and realize that it's worse than you thought. And so it was a quick switch for me where as soon as I started understanding what was happening, I became very, very anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what you've observed in your work, because you've clearly done this with a lot of people. Is it sort of a quick switch like that, or is it a slow process? It was interesting to see that it happens in people of all ages, but I'm just curious about the trigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Allegra. I've seen a mix of reactions, and I think part of that is even due to our own cognitive biases as human beings. Sometimes we're presented with a problem that is so large or seemingly intractable that it can even lead us to shut down or to deny that it's even as big of a problem, or to back away from fully comprehending all of the impacts. And sometimes, we'll swing back and forth between like the denial that gets us through the day and the heavy feelings all at once, the anxiety or the paralysis or the what do I do now? So I have seen a whole range of reactions. One thing I do appreciate about doing this work at this moment is the fact that there are terms to describe this state that are being increasingly used. So I do wonder to myself how many people have been experiencing these emotions like eco-anxiety, climate grief, etc., for a longer period of time, but have only recently begun naming them as such. Did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Blair?
Yes, I can.
I want to commend you for such a wonderful presentation. I think it's wonderful. I think one of the most important things that you and Waterspirit have done is put a label on this situation, and just sort of put it out there that this is something that happens and this is something that's going on. I think particularly among young people, but probably, like you say, all ages. So labeling it, I think, is extremely important so that people can identify it and take the 10 steps that you've identified. I have to say that I had eco-anxiety as a high schooler, and this was around the first Earth Day in 1970. Mm-hmm. And the way that was when everybody started moving into action, mm-hmm. and did Earth Day events and were organizing around it. And then there was quite a lull, I think, in people's, through the 80s and 90s, through people's attention to this subject. And now I see sort of a resurgence, which I think is very important. it's a resurgence with a lot more information, a lot more things happening. In those days, it was more invisible. So it was harder to identify. But the young people now, it's right in front of them. Our son lives in California where all the fires are going on. And so it is very visible and very identifiable. But it's a real thing, to be anxious over, particularly when you have children, young parents who are bringing, like you mentioned, bringing children into the world and wondering what their world is going to be like. I will say that I commend you for bringing this into a spiritual realm and a pastoral realm. My experience is that in the beginning, it started out on a biological level, partly because the concepts are the systems theory and the concepts of understanding the environment and the ecological systems of the environment can be quite complicated for a lot of people to understand, and how the systems are so related to one another. And if you change one, another one's going to change and throw off the balance of nature. So I think that in the beginning, that's why a lot of people avoided it. It's a complicated topic. But as a trained social worker, I've been very disappointed in the mental health fields stepping up in this field. And you mentioned the psychologists and psychiatry are just recently getting on board, and social work associations are also just recently getting on board. I think it's been way too slow in those areas. But I will say that I think that there's a very important faith-based place for this movement in our churches, just like the churches were among the first to recognize racial injustice, the first to recognize, sort of other injustices that have gone on. I think the church is really the place where this can move forward. So I just want to thank you. I think this has been a wonderful presentation, and you're a wonderful resource. And we're glad you're in New Jersey.
I am too. Thank you so much for your kind words. I appreciate your bringing social workers into this conversation as well. I actually don't know very much about what associations of social workers have been saying on this topic, and I would like to learn more. So I'll bring that in. And I'd like to highlight one more time that I definitely see the space for faith-based organizations, for churches, for religious groups to step in and address these states. I mean, faith-based organizations have experience addressing grief. They have experience with apocalyptic thinking through scripture. What does that even mean? There's so many tools already in hand that they can use to address the climate crisis that we're in. And furthermore, in my opinion, have the responsibility to use to address this the climate crisis, because especially now when we're in a moment of acute political crisis in the United States, embedded within a public health crisis, the pandemic, embedded within the climate crisis, I think more than ever, this is the time to be attuned to these different levels that can feed off of each other and perhaps worsen people's reactions or make their reactions more severe or acute, and to use all the tools at our disposal to address them simultaneously. I see a few questions in the chat, and I can get to. How can you teach other people about this? I know that I tend to info dump. I'm so interested in this topic that I just start throwing a bunch of resources at people. But a field guide to climate anxiety is a really fantastic book, in my opinion. If you're looking for something to give to somebody else that has a really good descriptions of the nuances of eco-anxiety and all the different ways it can manifest, as well as many tips for addressing it. So I think that book is an excellent resource for teaching people, and a great place to start. In addition to the Gen Dread blog and the Good Grief Network's website as well. Yes, and Liz is keeping up in the chat, so thank you so much for that. I also see the question in there, does climate change denial impact this anxiety in any way? I mean, I certainly believe that it does. This is another thread that I want to pick up from what was mentioned before. In, you know, in your telling of your impression of how environmentalism has changed throughout the generation, or changed throughout over time, throughout the decades. You mentioned a drop off in the 80s and 90s. I want to make sure that we're very clear on the fact that much that perceived drop off or climate change denial is has been deliberately cultivated by those who are most responsible for worsening the climate crisis, for causing climate change. ExxonMobil has known that fossil fuel burning causes climate change since at least the 1960s, and they invested at least $300 million in a deliberate misinformation campaign over the decades. So there are people responsible. It's not only the way that the human brain works that we're denying this major problem. And there's a deliberate misinformation campaign that continues to this day by the responsible parties. That's part of this. One thing I like about doing this work that addresses eco-anxiety is that it is so personal and one-on-one, and getting people to look within and tell their own stories and change their stories. And a lot of what I've been reading recently about climate change communications emphasizes the importance of storytelling. While some people can look at data and the science behind it and maybe, not be an expert in every field, but they find what changes their mind or spurs them to action through the data and the science, many people do not. Just presenting better data, more science, better science isn't necessarily what's going to change people's behavior. That's part of also why I enjoy working on this from a spiritual perspective. I think through storytelling, through individual storytelling, this is how climate change has impacted me. That resonates with people. That can often get people to change. And by addressing them also on a spiritual level, that reaches the level of values and morals that spurs us on to lasting change and long-lasting change. So those are the thoughts that come immediately to mind as I address the two questions that were in the chat. All right, now we'll open it back up to the floor. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question.
Blair, I want to thank you. The exercise was more revealing and potent than I had anticipated. I love being in the book club, and that's where I read climate anxiety and all kinds of good stuff. So that's another avenue for people. But to have had, to say I'm frustrated or sad or despondent, those are things that were there. But I also found like I was jealous of not being born in a different time on the planet. Something about before plastic was here and a big thing. And I had never looked at, some of that stuff that's kind of in there that can be triggered or come up in ways that aren't useful, aren't helpful for me or for any of the kind of advocacy work to be done. So that was, I have to say, I'm recognizing that every time we dip back into that kind of looking inside again, there seems to always be something else. You can always get a little deeper. So I want to thank you for that. And I also want to say that living here in Ocean Grove in a where, there's a church community that runs Ocean Grove, and there's this beautiful, the water and the beach, and the sense here on so many levels that we found this time that the water and these natural resources are not just for people with a lot of money and only the people that live here and own their homes here, that it really is a shared a gift. And how to have that happen. And here's the conflict that came up, that people were pouring in from so many areas and not having from the city, from Pennsylvania, that had never spent, so we had tons and tons of people here, and how to manage, well, first of all, to recognize that's what we gravitate to the water when we get stressed and this COVID and how it lifts us. And then how do we support a town to be able to manage that kind of thing? The resources that you need to have that happen are not the same resources when we're not in crisis. So again, it became sudden, you're immediately aware that all these positive both beliefs and intentions run into some issues around how to make that happen, how to live into that belief and that desire. So, and now I'm nervous about your map with the flood zones down around here. We took a leap of faith. We're hoping, when we moved, but anyway, I know I'm not alone with that. So I want to thank you for what you're doing.
It's always nice to see you, Angela. So thank you for your comments. What a thought that I had while I was listening to them is, you're absolutely right. None of these issues are easy to solve. That's part of why they have such an emotional impact on us. They are interconnected, but that's one of the features of ecology as well. And a quote that I return to time and again that helps me deal with my own sense of overwhelm when I'm feeling that is a quote by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, which I'd like to share now. She shares, "Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach." So when I'm feeling like it's all too big, I try and remember that I just have to do what's within my reach, and that everybody else, I trust will do what is within their reach. Mm-hmm. Yes, but Ocean Grove, I would definitely keep an eye on those maps and have your go bag.
Blair, again, thank you, yes, so much for this presentation. And I too, Angela, went through that list and found myself also just feeling that I'm so responsible. And that sense of responsibility, and surely you can try to excuse yourself because you didn't know better, but in fact, how could you not know better? So that's all part of it. And then raising children and having that responsibility to them. I think one of the areas that I would be very interested in, and I'm not sure, we can talk offline as well, but I do, having Gen Z people in my life, just knowing how much they have been experiencing with so much, with climate change, the COVID, the financial crises, all of these anxieties and things that absolutely affect their wellness. How do you have any thoughts as how to engage the young people to bring this forward in the church? The church is not necessarily where they are. So in order to provide a place for all, do you have any thoughts or suggestions? And it may be something, like I said, that we talk about offline, but how to engage and make that relevant for them so that they have a place to come first to experience their emotion, but then also to have the actions to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish I had an easy answer to the relevance of traditional church, like how to make it more relevant to younger generations. I know that that's a phenomenon we're seeing across the country. I mean, my impulse is to say that making the actions relevant will naturally draw the people who are supposed to be there. So I guess again, I'm not speaking from expertise when I make these suggestions, but my instinct is to say, bring programs to college campuses, de-emphasize church as building, emphasize church as collection of people supporting each other and moved by spirit to do that. And that, go where the people are, use the terms that have resonance that bring people in, and walk with humility to really listen to the experiences and to take seriously the experiences of younger people, and also the suggestions that they themselves already have for how to affect change, which in my experience are multiple. I mean, there are more climate activists in Gen Z than any other generation, as far as I know. I don't have an accurate statistic on that one, but that's my impression.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I love the idea of their, maybe just making it a place where they can tell their story, because I think that so many people are not aware of how deep that story goes for them.
Yeah.
And how much there is a connection between their story and the story of the older generations that actually could support each other. So you're giving me some ideas. So thank you.
That's great. I'm also going to, because I can't do a public talk without mentioning her, but another book that I love very much is by Dr. Melanie Harris. She wrote a book called Eco-Womanism. Now the subtitle, I might not quite correct it, but it's African-American Women in Earth Honoring Faiths. And she, in that book, talks about the tool of using your eco-memories to access this connection. So an eco-memory is any memory of yours or an ancestral memory. So it could be a story that got passed down to you that talks about your or your family's connection with the earth. Those eco-memories can sometimes be a jumping off place for starting to talk about changes in landscape over time that might eventually lead to action, or might lead to opening somebody's eyes to the severity of the climate crisis if they hadn't seen it before, hadn't seen the way that they themselves had been impacted, to feel moved to action by making it personal. So eco-memories, I think, is a great access point, and that all comes down to sharing stories, to listening to others, and to being heard, being heard ourselves in our own experiences.
What's her name again?
Melanie Harris. She's a professor at Texas Christian University. That one I'm going to pop in the chat too. Yes, you got it. Eco-memories is the term, but the book itself is Eco-Womanism.
Oh, okay.
Great.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think it can't be, I mean, from my observation, it can't be underestimated the power that even Greta Thunberg being willing to tell her story and to speak out in the way that she did, because I just saw, just living in New York, in the New York area, just the way so many young children really who really were maybe toddlers during Sandy, like have grown up with that as just a value and a sense that that's a role that they need to play, that's part of what they're here to do. And I was very, when you were talking about sharing stories, it occurred to me that was one of the ways just her honesty opened this up, for so many. And what was interesting too was to see some of the older generation embrace that wholeheartedly, and then others, like you were saying, for whom that was going to push against the narrative that they'd been really trying to sell, because there was such power in that, and it was coalescing so many people across the globe, which I appreciated your sort of naming what companies like Exxon have done to blind us, I guess. Somebody had asked in the chat, although I think it might have just been to me, if there are ways that those companies are being held accountable, and that if we knew that, would that help to lower our sense that they're being publicly held accountable, actionably held accountable.
There's a coalition that Waterspirit's part of called Pay Up Climate Polluters. It's very active here in New Jersey, and it's trying to do exactly that, to get towns to sign on to holding major polluters accountable.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And I think, Pat, if I'm not mistaken, it was Pat who mentioned this, the sense of almost dismay at one's own contribution to the climate crisis. Yeah, those feelings are very real. Many people share them. They can be hard to deal with, but I do encourage that while we, take the steps that we can to have, since our own lives are to some degree within our own control, at the same time, we are embedded in systems that have intentionally limited our choices. If there hadn't been this deliberate misinformation campaign, who knows what kind of clean energy technologies we would have seen by now, and that we would have had more choices as individual consumers. Like there's a lot of what ifs, right? So I would say honor those emotions, process them, continue to find the ways to alleviate them through personal actions, but at the same time, know that it's going to take collective and systemic action and change in order to really address this global crisis. Yeah.
Go ahead.
That was it. Blair, I can share, I like the piece about action alleviating some of the anxiety, direct action. And I can speak up for New Jersey. In fact, you probably know we have a lot going on in New Jersey in this respect. We have, we were one of the first states to, Rutgers University has a program training residents called the Environmental Stewards Program. You're probably familiar with that. We did, New Jersey has the group of environmental commissions who can take actions for sustainable Jersey and get points, which is really, it's all based on, doing certain things for the environment, and then you get certified as a town. I'm speaking as a member of an environmental commission for many years here. And, so there are a lot of ways that people can link into action in New Jersey. Sort of like necessity is the mother of invention. And people are surprised that New Jersey is moving forward almost as much as California, if not more than California is in terms of the environmental front. So I do, think that action has a lot to do with it. However, I think that your piece is very, very important, because in all those actions, people are telling their stories, but there isn't enough room for the emotional piece of it. And but I do want people to know that there are avenues to take action in New Jersey. You just have to seek them out. And one place to start is in your town. In your town's environmental commission. And if they don't have an environmental commission, then to start one.
Absolutely. Those are wonderful resources. Thank you for bringing them into this conversation. There are so many ways to get involved. One more time, I am going to plug also my organization, Waterspirit, and our rapid response team. It's headed up by somebody who's actually a part of Sustainable New Jersey as well, which is not over at Waterspirit. So it's the interconnections between all these groups is fascinating to map, and it's so heartening as well. It's part of seeing the landscape. There's so many people doing this good work. And I also, while we're giving, it's actually waterspirit.org.
Yep, sorry.
And shout out to New Jersey. Final note on that. Last year, New Jersey passed landmark environmental justice legislation to protect overburdened communities from the cumulative impacts of pollution. So that is hopefully going to set the standard for the nation going forward. Like, it's legislation that's really forward thinking. And I'm so excited for that to start being implemented once the rulemaking process is completed.
Fascinating. Just so thank you so much just for a rich evening, and so much for us to continue to think about and work about. And I would also commend your organization. I know that you help other communities, organizations, churches, community groups to work on some of these small group. I saw you had a lot of resources on your website. So I think I would encourage people in whatever corners of the country you are to know that maybe you can begin some of this work in smaller groups and storytelling and sharing and action wherever you are. So thank you once again for being part of this community, this wellness project. Friends, you are always welcome. You are on the list, free to unsubscribe. But if this is your first time with us, we hope it won't be your last time. We do a variety of programs. Next week, though, it is an inauguration, and there's a lot of anxiety around that. We're just going to gather together on this space next week just for some time of listening to our spirits, our own stories, some music, some prayer. So you are warmly welcome to attend just that inauguration evening meditation time. But without further ado, I'll let you go out into your week. Finally, with one more thanks to Blair, and to just commend all of you to be well. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.